today from all around the globe. So as the case may be, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thank you for joining us today for our program on non-medical switching of biologicals, biosimilars in Canada, Europe, and the United States. My name is Steve Strani, and I am pleased to serve as your moderator today. We have a great panel of presentations for you, a really full panel of experience and skills and perspectives, including representatives from patients, physicians, pharmacists, regulators, advocates, and industry. I'd also like to take a moment to thank our sponsoring organizations and several individuals who have put a lot of time and effort into putting together today's presentations. And that includes Michael Riley and the Alliance for Safe Biologic Medicines, and Lazia Tang and the Generics and Biosimilars Initiative. Thank you so much for your leadership and your hours of dedication in putting together today's forum. If you have any questions today, we urge you to use the question function on the platform and send them through to us for a couple reasons. First, in the latter half of the forum today, we're going to have a discussion among all of the presenters, and we'll be looking for your questions to put before them. But in addition, we anticipate that there may be more questions than we can answer in the time that's allotted, but we do commit to you that after the presentations today, we will get back to everybody with answers to your questions. So today's event is the second in a series of webinars that we're focusing in this area. Today's webinar is, as we noted, on non-medical switching. And for those of you who missed it, the first webinar was just a couple weeks ago, and you can hear the entire event, replay it. There's the QR code for accessing that, where you can also find it fairly easily on the web. And I'd be remiss if we didn't mention our upcoming webinar that all of you will be receiving emails about in the near future. We're going to be focusing on ophthalmic biosimilars in our September webinar. So for today, here's our slate of presenters, and you can see that we've got a great variety of perspectives here to address these issues. And in addition to the folks that you have listed here who have prepared remarks, we're going to have a couple additional folks from the patient advocacy community. That includes Jamie Maghop, who is from the Gastrointestinal Society in Canada, serving as their outreach coordinator, and Urvashi Rathod, who is the project officer for the International Federation of Aging in Canada. So with that, I'd like to introduce our first speaker today. Our first speaker, and if let's see if you can all advance to Michael's slides. Our first speaker is Michael Riley. We're really lucky in this community to have somebody with Michael's background, who is helping serve as a leader in this area. Michael is the executive director of the Alliance for Safe Biologic Medicines, and he has served in this role for over a dozen years since the inception of the organization. He has engaged with stakeholders and regulators throughout the United States and also throughout North America, Europe, and the rest of the globe. Prior to joining ASBM, Michael served as an active public servant at the very highest levels of the healthcare government in the United States. In particular, he worked at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services between 2002 and 2008 and served as the Associate Deputy Secretary of HHS. That's significant because in that role, he was overseeing not only the U.S. FDA, but also an agency called CMS. And for those of you who are not familiar with the system in the United States, CMS oversees our largest public health programs in the U.S., Medicare that serves the elderly and disabled, and also the state federal partnerships that we call Medicaid that serves low-income folks in the United States. So a broad breadth of experience. With that, Michael, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Steve, and thanks to all of the panelists and also obviously to those who are participating today. As Steve mentioned, this is the second in a series of webinars for us. And when Lazia Tang and I began to think about putting together a webinar series, we really viewed the first two webinars as going together as a pairing. Because in order to really understand biosimilars, you have to look at where they have been successfully introduced. Steve mentioned kind of how broad the participation was in that first webinar, and I think it's important to note that there were 58 countries represented at that first webinar among the participants, and there was 10% of those who were signed up to participate were regulators. So as Steve mentioned, my background, I think it's important to kind of keep in context that we at ASBM, and certainly the work that I have done has been looking towards building significant healthcare policy. Steve mentioned the HHS work that I did over my shoulder. You can see one in particular, there's a couple of pieces of legislation that I'm particularly proud to have worked on, including the introduction of Part D, the Medicare prescription drug benefit for the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. I was there for all phases of that, and also the Children's Health Act of 2000. And so my background really is to look at policy and see, how do you put together good, successful policy? And so for me to begin with looking at that first webinar, we really got to dig in and see what are the things that made Europe and the US, who is now catching up quickly, the leaders in biosimilars. And then most of today's program will be focused on looking at non-medical switching. So little of that will be focused on the US and the EU because they don't really do it there. And I'll get into that in a moment. I think it's well established that Europe is widely regarded as the leader in biosimilars across the globe, not just because they did it first, but because they really did it methodically, and they built a program that not only started out and has been there for a considerable period of time, but it's both increased uptake, it's increased savings, but it's viewed as robust. When you think of Europe, you don't think, obviously, of Europe is not monolithic. It is a variety of countries. And so they all do things a little bit differently. And I'll talk about that over the next 10 minutes. But in large part, they have been successful. Many countries, including Canada, wish to emulate Europe's success and catch up. But I would argue that in order to catch up, you need to understand how Europe did it. The basis for our first webinar was really a white paper that was written by myself and Dr. Philip Snyder, who will present in a little bit. And it was really to look at the specific principles which can be applied to anybody in any country if they're trying to develop an efficient and sustainable biosimilar market. It specifically identified some must-have principles that are critical. And again, these principles are by looking at the way the Europeans have done it. And many of them they have talked about consistently over a period of stakeholder meetings, which I'll talk about in a second. The first is that physicians should have the freedom to choose between biosimilars and biologics based on the best interests of the patient. Obviously, with regards to the interference of physician-patient relationship, it is generally assumed that the physician-patient relationship is foundational in terms of understanding what is in the best interests of the patient. Secondly, looking at the European system, they have over a number of countries, they have tender systems. And those tenders, from looking at the Europeans, basically they believe that it's important to have no winner-take-all tenders and tenders based upon things other than simply price. And then the third is, and this is extremely important, and we'll get into this in much more detail as you listen to other presenters looking at the Canadian system, that is a level playing field between all of the participating manufacturers, innovators, biosimilar manufacturers. Obviously, there's overlap between the innovators and the biosimilar manufacturers in general, but just making sure that all competitors are able to compete to put downward pressure on prices. In addition to this, and this really goes to a lot of what I've done over the course of my background before ASBM, and that is really collaborative approach. The Europeans, in particular led by the European Commission, have held a continuous series of multi-stakeholder consultations. The last one of these was in October 30th, 2019. I was fortunate to be in attendance there, and so really was able to get a good sense of how they talk about the successes they have had, but also are very forward-looking in terms of improving on their performance. Right before I participated in that meeting in Brussels, I presented the results of a European physician survey that we had conducted in 2019. And that survey was looking at a whole host of issues across by looking at the European, Western European physicians in Spain, Italy, the UK, France, Switzerland, and Germany. And the most important thing I think that was a little surprising but very well received at that ESMO presentation was that obviously European physicians have great knowledge, great trust, great confidence in biosimilars. And yet over the course of time, so we were updating a survey that was done in 2013, and what we saw was that as their confidence, knowledge grew with biosimilars, so too did their belief that they were strongly opposed to non-medical switching. That is, switching that was not directed for medical reasons and that was not done in consultation or at the direction of physicians. In reality, non-medical switching in Europe is extremely rare. In nearly every European country, physicians and patients choose freely among multiple approved products, originator and biosimilars, and most or all are reimbursed. Non-medical switching is permitted in some poorer Eastern European countries, although usually there is an option for patients to pay a price difference, still having the option of getting something other than the biosimilar. And the real outlier, basically, and this was reflected in that European Commission meeting, is Denmark. Basically, Denmark is really, as the Denmark regulator said, and he presented in that European Commission meeting, they have one of the most radical programs of biosimilar switching in the world. That is, that it is, they very clearly say patients are not given a choice regarding a switch. They have a single tender system, again, something that the Europeans do not think is a good idea. And that was again mentioned in this European Commission meeting. They have a very small population. They're ethnically homogeneous. And this was really the most important point that came out on the European Commission meeting when they said, don't look to Denmark as a model, because Denmark is the only country in Europe that has every patient covered by digitized medical records. And why that is important, obviously, is with regards to being able to keep track of adverse events. What about the United States? Well, the US is definitely catching up to Europe. Market shares are now catching up to European market rates. Over the last couple of years, the US biosimilars introduced the first, the FDA introduced and approved the first 2 interchangeable biosimilars and the first ophthalmic biosimilar. What we are seeing now is that in the US, we're seeing increased competition. The US biosimilars, this from a recent article, will likely go from an average of 3 competitors to probably upwards of 5 in every single one of the existing therapeutic markets. So obviously it is these competitors, the increase in the number of competitors, that is helping drive down price. All of this positive momentum creates competition and results in patients having access to more affordable treatments. And I mentioned the opportunity to lead on ophthalmic biosimilars, and I know Steve mentioned that we will have a webinar in September on that very topic. The non-medical switching policy in the US is that they really don't have non-medical switching. Because, and similar to Europe, they have thriving markets, high uptake rates, and savings are due to many products competing for market share. All 50 states do permit automatic substitution for interchangeable biosimilars, and those are, as Leah Krista will talk about interchangeability in a few moments, those are have additional data. So it is a regulatory standard which have additional data, including switching studies involved. The Canadian non-medical switching policy is really a stark contrast to that of Europe. And today, you're going to hear from other panelists how the Canadian approach needlessly excludes physicians and patients from the treatment decision process, contributes to Canada lagging behind Europe and the US, and it prioritizes short-term savings over long-term growth and sustainability. From the beginning, Canadian patient groups have opposed non-medical switching. Physician groups have also opposed non-medical switching. And so today, going forward, you're going to hear from the Canadian Organization for Rare Disorders, that is CORD, and from the Gastrointestinal Society and other presenters to talk about specifically the contrast between the US, EU, and Canadian systems. For more information, I would recommend that you look to our GaBI white papers. And again, thanks to everyone participating today. And with that, Steve, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thanks, Michael. Our next speaker today is Gail Atara. Gail serves as the president and CEO of the Gastrointestinal Society in Canada. And the Gastrointestinal Society represents patients who have inflammatory bowel disease on multiple issues, but that includes access to their medications. She also serves as the executive director of a sister charitable organization called the Canadian Society of Intestinal Research. Gail is going to be joining us today via a pre-recorded message. And as I mentioned earlier, her colleague, Jamie Maghop, is going to join us for the discussion at the end of our event. With that, I'll turn it over.
I'm Gail Atara, President and Chief Executive Officer of the Gastrointestinal Society. We've worked closely with ASBM for close to a decade now on important issues, including non-medical switching. My pre-recorded presentation will lay out the state of non-medical switching from the perspective of Canadian patients. And I'm really sorry that I can't be there today live for the panel discussion, but our outreach coordinator, Jamie Maghop, who has been working closely with me over the last 3 years on this topic, will represent the GI Society on the panel discussion to answer any questions you might have. In Canada, it's really important for you to understand that we do have universal medical health care, but that's only for physician visits and hospital use. It's not for medications. And so in Canada, we have a very tightly managed, variable by jurisdiction, limited publicly funded drug coverage. So that's the context in which I'm going to say the rest of this talk. And we are also the only country in the world with pharma-provided patient support programs for biologic medications. Again, it's going to be very key as I sort of unfold what's going on in Canada, so you'll be able to see. Because the downside is that when you change your biologic medication, some of your healthcare team changes, and that's really going to be key in how patients have responded to switching. So we've been active in this area since 2013. In Canada, we originally called this subsequent entry biologics, and I spoke at a CADTH conference in 2013. Now, CADTH is our health technology assessment body. So I spoke at that point about the concerns patients were having with medication changes and what these biosimilars and the implications for them in Canada ongoing. Then we created some patient information pamphlets so that we could give some education. These are available on our website, and we hand them out printed. Hundreds of thousands of these have gone across Canada to educate the public about what biologics and biosimilars are. So the switching and substitution are the two key words we're going to be talking about. And switching, everybody knows that when you're on a medication throughout your life in having medications, you've switched medication, and that's okay. It happens all the time, but that's because perhaps your medication wasn't working and your physician wants to try something else. So that in that case, it's a medical switch. There's a reason for it. But what we're going to be talking about is non-medical switch, and that's vitally not okay because it usually happens, it could happen with the consent of your physician or without, but it's usually for reasons not related to your health and and the care of you. And then in Canada, we also have substitution at the pharmacy level, where a pharmacist can substitute. Not every jurisdiction in Canada allows this, but a pharmacist can substitute it right at the pharmacy counter. So you walk up with a prescription for a specific product, and the pharmacist can substitute that. So in 2015, we did a survey to find out what those in our therapeutic area, so we did this just for inflammatory bowel disease, and what they knew and understood about what was then called subsequent entry biologics. And so this is the outcome from this, was that we asked them, how important is it to you for your physician to have the sole authority to decide? And as you can see, 78% said very important, 17% said somewhat important. And, this was really a key sort of learning point for us. And we wanted to understand what our patient population wanted. And that was a number of 354 on this. Then we asked them, how concerning would it be for you if the pharmacist or government or your private insurance plan made the determination which biologic you were on? And again, people are saying, that no, they're not. It's very important that and so they're very concerned about this on initiation of treatment. So this is just if you're naive to any kind of medicine, and that's what the question was asked. So then we went and asked, what about during your treatment? If you're in the middle of treatment, you're on a biologic, an originator biologic, and then now you have to switch. And as you see, the numbers just shot through the roof. So we had a total of 96% really who was important to. And so based on this and the information that we got from patients, we had this sort of moral authority to go ahead and act on behalf of those inflammatory bowel disease patients who we were representing. And so we also went to the European Crohn's and Colitis Organization conference in Amsterdam in 2015 and presented this data in a poster that was accepted there. And it's interesting that the group right beside us who was presenting was a patient group from Europe, and they had almost identical results. We were going through things question by question, and the results, we didn't even know this. We didn't organize it in advance. So it was showing that this was really an honest perception of patients really around the world. Then we created a video in 2016. This is available on our website in both English and French. It's still valid. Everything that's in it is still true. So we really thought about the future and how things might play out in this whole biosimilars area. Then we formed the Canadian Biosimilars Working Group. And it had so here I've listed who are current members of this group, and the website you can go to find more information. But the reality is that we have switched participants throughout the course of time. Some oncology groups were part of it, and they're not now. Oncology is handled quite differently in Canada than some of the other therapeutic areas. And so the number of different groups that we've had have varied over time. So then we created a focus group in 2017 for biosimilars, with a total of 5 groups. And we also had several cross-country focus groups that were really intense, in person, where the viewers are behind the screens listening to the participants talk about what their experiences are. And we learned a lot during that. And it's really interesting that survey, we got 657 participants in just 2 weeks. And the majority of them were in Crohn's and colitis, because although the Arthritis Society did lead that, we were active participants and were able to generate those kinds of participants in that. And the key findings from that was that this was before switching occurred in Canada. And so people were just hearing about it, wondering what it would be like and what the experience would be going forward. So there was a great emotional impact from the disease. They're thinking about the processes that you already have to go through in Canada to get your drug approved. And that this was the first time that this kind of mass switching was going to happen. And so we were really in a trial and error experiment. And so anxiety was high. There was poor understanding of what was going to happen. Most were opposed to this forced non-medical switching. It just didn't seem very Canadian, if you want to sort of go at the Canadian way of doing things. And it really was counter to anything that we had done before. And so there was also great concern that switching would reopen access and coverage questions. And just to tell you about who regulates drugs in Canada, we have Health Canada. They're the regulator. And even they came forward and said that the authorization of a biosimilar is not a declaration of equivalence in Canada, and that although they expected no differences in safety and efficacy, they still say, the Health Canada still says, that the decision should be made by the treating physician. So that's our regulator. And then we have a health technology assessment bodies, and they even said that so CADTH is the national one in Canada, and INES is Quebec only. It's really driven to identify what's going on in that province, although other provinces do rely on the information that INES generates. It's a really good body. They thoroughly assess things, and it is a reputable source, as is CADTH. So CADTH said that the individual patients and their practitioners should make those decisions about switching, and INES says that there are significant concerns that clinicians have about non-medical switching, and they should be considered. So even our regulator and our health technology assessment bodies are all saying, we're not saying you have to switch. However, and then here's some of the medical associations too. So the medical associations, I've only picked 2 here, although they all have position statements. The Canadian Association of Gastroenterology, who we really work closely with, do not recommend non-medical switching. And then the Canadian Rheumatology Association says that they're a little softer, and they say that it must be respectful and informed conversation between the rheumatologist and their patient, and that there should be no substitution without an informed consultation. So that's it. And I mean, there were a lot of other patient associations who have position statements too, but they're all kind of similar. So I'm just going to talk about what happened in Canada very, very briefly, very high level. So Canada's non-medical switch policies. British Columbia was the first province. It's the 3rd largest province. It happens to be where I live. And they announced a hard switch in 2019 in May for certain disease areas, for rheumatoid arthritis, ankylosing spondylitis, plaque psoriasis, psoriatic arthritis, and one medication for diabetes, not all medications. And then later that year, they announced it for Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis. Just one thing I wanted to go back and just talk briefly about is that it was a really hard policy, no exceptions, just you got to do it, and that's it. And it really generated a lot of concerns, which I'll get to in a few seconds. So Alberta, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia are 3 smaller provinces, and they had some modified switch policies with some exceptions during the pandemic. And Quebec last year came out with a switch policy that offered a year to switch, and there were exceptions that we had a hand in helping them modify their policies. So I'm much more comfortable now with the policy as it is in Quebec, whereas British Columbia's policy still was never a good policy. And Ontario, Canada's largest province, is considering a switching policy, but it's been delayed by the pandemic and politics, because we know politics plays an important part in all of this. So then we did another survey in 2020, and This was the response demographic. Still a lot of individuals with inflammatory bowel diseases of Crohn's and ulcerative colitis, but as you can see, there were a lot of other individuals as well. And we also had, in addition to the survey responses, we had more than 100 calls and emails to our office. And so those were all compiled into this report. The bottom line was that there were a lot of delays, lack of communication. There were people showing up to support programs. Remember, the patient support programs in Canada are run by the pharmaceutical companies, and you go there, you change your drug, you change your program, and so they might not have been ready for you for that change to occur. And so there was lack of coverage for issues related to the biosimilar. It was just a gong show. There were some key issues, though, and I won't dwell on these too much, but they're very important, is that 66% said there was some kind of mental health component related to this. And there were timing issues, and there was generally still a lack of biosimilar education, even with the tools that we have in place. But they would go to their physicians, and they would just be told you have to switch without really it being explained. And some more key issues were that there were exclusive contracts with these patient support programs, and the high denial rate when physicians asked for special authority to remain on the originator biologic, they were rejected. Basically, straight out, the provinces just said, nope, sorry, you can't, there's no exception. And these are the things that were really brutal. And this is why I'm really glad that Quebec has adopted an exception program. So it's really hard when a government policy just forces you to do something that really, for all individuals, and we should have that flexibility for care. And still, most respondents were now familiar with biologic medications, which is really good. It means we are explaining to them what the biologic medications are, but still the individual policies that have rolled out in the provinces are not that explained. And they still believe, though, that their physician should have the sole authority to decide the best biologic medicine for their disease. So even if they're familiar with it, they understand everything. The bottom line is the position hasn't changed really from when we began this journey. Now, we did one final survey that I'm going to mention, and that was in 2021. It was a smaller survey, really drilling down to what was going on in the two provinces, Alberta and British Columbia, that had changed their policies the earliest. And some quotes were really good and positive. So it was positive, so far so good, and the same as the original. There was this whole thing about the biologic and biosimilar for the adalimumab product. Some had a product in it that made it sting, and some of them did not. So some biologics, originator biologics, they changed their formula and it didn't sting anymore. And now the new one stung when injected. So these are really important just at the patient level and how important that is. And then side effects. So they did range. But really, it was too soon to tell with the adalimumab product in these provinces. And the majority were not confident in their ongoing care. I think that's really important. There was never enough time to switch. There was scheduling difficulties, communication problems, with the overlaying confounding factor of the pandemic. And then our biosimilar position has always been that they should set one price for reimbursement for all originator biologics and their respective biosimilars. They're not going for that. If the lowest cost alternative happens in all kinds of small molecules all the time, and we think it could have actually expanded to the large molecules, but there is no appetite for this in any of our jurisdictions. And so we then came out with some compromise papers, and these are available on our website as well, policy documents. We did good biosimilar policy in Canada, what that looks like. Some exclusion examples, and also we debunked a whole bunch of myths around non-medical switching, and you're welcome to just have a look at badgut.org. And so those, I'll just highlight what those are, what we think are important, and Quebec adopted to these also, is that provide a longer time frame for switching children and be cautious in elderly patients and transferring individuals from pediatric to adult care. We wanted exceptions for those with severe disease and other high-risk patients, which we also defined in our paper. We wanted exclusions for mental health. And I think that we have to respect the fact that mental health is a big issue, and it doesn't just go away on its own. Individuals need attention and care for this, and mental health has to be a factor in any kind of policy decision. And of course, pregnant women. And we had one more thing in Canada, being the geographic size of our country, is that there were logistical and geographic considerations that really are in place in accessing care. When the patient support programs came up for the biosimilars, not all of them were in the same locations as the originator biologic patient support programs were. And so we had to, really make huge adaptations. So that's basically the journey in Canada. And I thank you for listening, and thank you for your part in all this. And thank you for taking the time to learn about what's going on in the rest of the world for biologics, originator biosimilars.
Well, thank you, Gail. Pleased now to introduce Dr. Ralph Mckibbett. Dr. Mckibbett is a physician, an author, and a very active volunteer. He has a gastroenterology practice in Pennsylvania in the United States. He is the past president of the Pennsylvania Society of Gastroenterology. He is the past president of the Digestive Disease National Coalition, and he's serving as the chairman of the Alliance for Safe Biologic Medicines. He's written extensively on such issues as insurance industry utilization management techniques and the impacts and implications on patient care and access. With that, Dr. Mckibbett.
Thank you, everyone, and thanks for this opportunity. I'm going to be looking and speaking today on U.S. physician concerns. So I'm a patient advocate, and I always believe in the stakeholder approach and working with others, but I'm going to narrow that focus here to look at how U.S. physicians are looking at this journey on non-medical switching for biologics and biosimilars. So this is me. I'm a past president, as noted above, and an actively practicing gastroenterologist. And so that colors the way that I look at things. I have at the core of my being the doctor-patient relationship. And so when we look at this, I'm going to try and give a few insights. Numbers are numbers, but I don't want to extrapolate beyond the survey other than just maybe to give some insights as to what we got here. So the ASBM commissioned a survey, the U.S. survey methodology here of 400 patients. The research was done about a year ago, almost a year ago, and was distributed across 12 specialties, all of which were fields that use biosimilars and biologic therapies. It was across the entire United States. Almost every state was representative, a diverse geographic representation. Some rural areas and small population states weren't there, and you can see that in the full survey. But everyone who was in the survey or participated was a prescriber. So one of the things that you hear is that the physicians perhaps are colored against biosimilars, and we have a rut there. But in fact, we found in the survey that U.S. physicians are very confident in biosimilar medications. And I think that's because of the track record of, for instance, in the U.S. of the FDA. We believe in the process for approvals of medications, and we have an inherent trust. And so we believe that these medicines are safe and efficacious. This level of comfort is similar to what we see in the Canadian and European physicians in other past surveys. And I won't just say this as an aside, that these surveys are available on our website if you wish to look back. There is some insights, I think, to be gained at looking at the trends. But U.S. physicians are comfortable with biosimilars and have no problem with the idea of giving this to new patients. So if you come in and you have a sort of Crohn's disease in my field, I would be comfortable giving you a biosimilar as opposed to a originator product. Where we get into some concerns then is we're less comfortable with non-medical switching. We go into the idea that we like the idea of we're required to do a doctor-patient relationship, informed consent, discussing things with our patient. And so just to have it switched, well, we would do it if we could discuss it with the patient, let them know the pros and cons. As we saw in our last presentation, there are things at play here, such as mental health, geography, et cetera, which are important. So switching isn't easy sometimes. And I just want to talk about the patient in general. We tend to look at patients when we look at these studies and statistics as like single entities. We got a Crohn's patient, a rheumatoid arthritis patient, something like that. And it's actually much more complex than that. As an example, yesterday I saw a patient who had Crohn's, rheumatoid arthritis, Hashimoto's thyroiditis, and a couple other immune diseases. So when you get into switching people like that, there's a lot of nuances there. And then perhaps, as we saw again in that last presentation, what about someone who's pregnant? Do you want to switch them? Is that the time to do such a thing? What if they just got stabilized, et cetera? So there's a lot of depth to what's going on here, severity of disease, et cetera. And as we know, there's a lot of mechanisms for disease. We have different mechanisms of action. So it's not like all of these are one product. So we want to be sure that's there. So anyway, you see some hesitancy and not quite so comfortable in switching here. We're dropping down to 80%, but that's physician-led switching. Globally, it's not as comfortable if you look at the Latin American and European versus Canadian and US. There's some disparity there, but there is still anxiety across the board. Not anxiety, I shouldn't use that word, but discomfort with the idea of non-medical switching. But that's even physician-led switching. So why the concerns? Well, I've started talking about some of that. And it goes back to, again, like I said, all plans are not universal. All patients are not the same. It's not a unidimensional process. There's a timeline here. And some people, physicians as an example, are newer practitioners. Some people have long-term patients, 20, 30 years of disease. When someone's stable, you rock the boat, and there's a lot of cost to the system when you take people into a different journey. So what are we least comfortable with? Well, third-party non-medical switching. We addressed that before, and what we see here is we are not comfortable in the United States with third-party switching, and that's echoed in the Canadian and EU studies there. So 58% of people are uncomfortable. So the idea that you can have your medication switched on a stable patient is something that we really do not like. So what are the concerns, perhaps in the survey, to get into details? Unknown immunogenicity. For instance, if you look at regular medications, there's the medication component, but there's binders. So could there be something else in the biosimilar that wasn't recognized in the initial small studies, and that we need long-term data? Maybe there's something that's going to happen in our complex patients. Immunogenicity is different across different diseases. Some medical diseases treated with a biosimilar are more immunogenic with more antibodies versus other disease treated with the same biologic. So it isn't the same experience from specialty to specialty. So we worry about relapse, patient symptoms coming back. The legal liability, I think, is there. That's always a concern, particularly in the US, but that isn't really what guides this. As long as we're doing things above board, that isn't an anxiety. I think people worry they might be getting blindsided and having patient dissatisfaction. Potential impact on adherence, we saw that in our Canadian journey that was just presented. Things happen, people get off their medicines. There are studies out there showing that these happen. Psychological impacts, again, back to the mental health part, and support system has to change. Different way of getting the medicine, different delivery methods, etc. So what do we wish, is some control, I think. Physicians agree, ability to prevent a substitution is needed. And we see this across the world in these different studies over the years. So as we go along and gain more experience with biosimilars, it's very important or critical that we can prevent third-party substitution if we feel for a medical reason that shouldn't happen. We want more data before this automatic substitution happens. It takes it out of the hands of the doctor-patient relationship back to this kind of a one-size-fits-all, monolithic, one-dimensional patient, which doesn't really exist. And so we want to know what the nuances are, that additional data. We also see this in Australia, where the physicians wanted studies before the automatic substitution that was there. If you see down there on the left, the majority, 53% of Australian physicians wanted clinical trials showing that there was no loss of efficacy, and then 81% wanted switching studies prior to permitting automatic substitution. Canadian studies, just to echo what we just said earlier, 82% feel that their studies should be done. So we've talked earlier, and we'll continue to talk today about physician organizations. The physician viewpoint, we oppose automatic substitution. This is the Australian Rheumatology Society paper there, and the Canadian, as shown earlier. So what has the US done, or what are we looking at, something that's maybe different? The concept of interchangeable biosimilars. An FDA had designated category of interchangeable says that we'll get additional data, longer term data, not only just the pharmacokinetic data, but the toxicity data, et cetera, and we'll create this category of interchangeable, which would mean that this would allow the substitution to occur at the pharmacy level, much as it does with generic drugs. So we're highly supportive of the idea of interchangeability. What we want is transparency. We know that this isn't a simple disease process. If you look at the list of the 5 societies there on the left, yeah, we want this data, and we applaud the FDA for this thoughtful guidance. The interchangeable biosimilar designation does make physicians more comfortable with prescribing and substitution. So more likely to prescribe the interchangeable biosimilar versus the other, and more comfortable with the idea of pharmacy substitution, as shown in those green bars. So in summary, where are US physicians coming from? What's our perspective? We believe in biosimilars. We think they're safe and they're efficacious. We're not reluctant to prescribe them to new patients. Where we become a little less comfortable is with the switching. So if the physician is guiding in conjunction with the patient in an informed process, 20% are not comfortable doing it, but 80% would be. And then the majority of US physicians are not comfortable with non-medical switching done for economic reasons and also outside our control. We don't like to be blindsided and have patients come back and say things are different. And this is seen and echoed across the world. So I think it's an attribute likely of physicians and the way we take care of people. So in the physicians in the US want this additional data showing that switching can be done safely and it doesn't jeopardize the stability of the patient's condition. The interchangeable biosimilar shows great promise, we think, and this addresses a lot of the US physician concerns about switching and builds confidence. Thank you for your attention. And now, of course, we'll have questions later. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. McKibbett. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Leah Crystal. Dr. Crystal has extensive experience across a broad range of areas. She has worked as a regulator and as a researcher, and now most recently in industry. She currently serves at Amgen as the Executive Director of Global Biosimilars Regulatory Affairs and Regulatory and R&D Policy. Previously, she served at the U.S. Food and Drug Administration for about 14 years. And her last roles at the agency included Associate Director for Therapeutic Biologics and Director of the Therapeutic Biologics and Biosimilars staff. She earned her PhD in Environmental Molecular Microbiology at the Medical University of South Carolina. Dr. Crystal?
Thank you very much. Happy to be here. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking more specifically about the regulatory framework in the US as it relates to interchangeability of biologics and biosimilars. So to start, it's important, I think, that we, kind of lay some groundwork around terminology. And we've heard some different terms today. And so just to put everybody on the same page going forward, it's important to note that definitions of substitution, switching, and interchangeability can be different. And terminology really matters when we're having this conversation. So the practice of pharmacy substitution is where one drug is dispensed in place of another at the pharmacy level without consulting the prescriber. So that universally is sort of looked at as pharmacy substitution. That's a well accepted and I think understood term. Switching, on the other hand, is where a physician may elect to prescribe one medicine in place of another with the same therapeutic intent. And so this is going to be a prescriber-led switching decision. However, in Europe, in the context of biosimilars, the term switching has been used synonymously with the term interchangeable, and it's created some confusion globally. So again, just want to sort of level set here as we're talking about interchangeability as it relates to the US. For interchangeability in the US, this is a term that's defined by legal statute. And we'll talk more about the definition of interchangeability, what it means in the US. But interchangeability in the US really tracks back to pharmacy substitution, not prescriber-led switching. So how does the US law define interchangeability? So in the US, an interchangeable biosimilar needs to meet the standards for biosimilarity. So it's going to be highly similar and also have no clinically meaningful differences. It's going to be expected to produce the same clinical result in any given patient. And for a product that's administered more than once, the risk to safety or diminished efficacy as a result of switching is no greater than the risk of using the reference product without such switching. So this is the legal definition that's set out in statute. So it's important to understand that a designation as an interchangeable biosimilar requires additional data. So there's these additional statutory elements beyond biosimilarity. I'm sorry, I'm getting a little bit of a background noise. I don't know if someone can mute their line. So it does require additional data to demonstrate interchangeability beyond that biosimilarity standard. So there's additional data and information to scientifically support this statutory definition and ultimately support pharmacy level substitution. However, this designation as an interchangeable biosimilar does not imply anything about the quality of the product. Non-interchangeable biosimilars are held to the same quality standards as interchangeable biosimilars. They are all biological products. They're held to the same standards as any biological product from a quality and manufacturing perspective. So an interchangeable biosimilar is not a quote unquote better biosimilar. It's just a biosimilar that's undergone additional testing to generate additional data and information to support meeting this statutory definition and ultimately be eligible for pharmacy level substitution. This designation is not required for physicians to prescribe a biosimilar in place of the reference product to treat treatment-naive patients or patients that are currently in treatment. So again, tracking back to that prescriber-led switching component, you don't need to have an interchangeability designation for a prescriber to make a decision to switch their patient from one product to another. However, it's important to note that in all circumstances, physicians should be practicing evidence-based medicine and consider the risks and benefits of switching patients between a reference product and its biosimilar, amongst biosimilars, et cetera, and really, have that conversation with their patient about what's best. So we've heard a little bit about the concept of switching studies. So what evidence does support an interchangeability designation? We talk about that additional data and information to support this. So when the aspect of this can be expected to produce the same clinical result as the reference product in any given patient, FDA has outlined in guidance that this is really an expectation of a scientific justification to support the expectation of same clinical performance in all of the reference product's conditions of use. So this interchangeable product doesn't need to seek approval for or be approved for all of the reference product's conditions of use, indications, patient populations. But within their application, they need to provide a justification that it would be expected to have the same clinical performance in all the reference products' conditions of use. Also, aspects of the presentation and device, The design differences must not adversely impact use or performance. And so there's an aspect of data information that would be in the application that would look at differences between the reference product and the potential interchangeable biosimilar from the standpoint of the presentation and device design to make sure in the environment of substitution that there won't be any adverse impacts. In terms of looking at the risk to safety or diminished efficacy, where you're alternating or switching back and forth between the reference product and the proposed interchangeable product. This is where we look at the switching study. And there's an example of a design here where you would have a lead-in period of subjects in the study on the reference product. That you would randomize the patients and have a comparison between a switching arm and a non-switching arm and look to see certain endpoints, parameters. The guidance focuses on pharmacokinetics, potentially pharmacodynamics, also safety and immunogenicity endpoints of making sure that there's no difference in the subjects who are in the switching arm versus those that are maintaining therapy on the reference product and not switching. So we have two examples in the US of interchangeable products that have been approved by FDA. One is Semglee, which is insulin glargine. And the application did include evidence to support interchangeability, which included a switching study with reference insulin glargine, which is Lantus. And you can see the study design information that's here, but looking at efficacy, insulin dose, safety, and immunogenicity when type 1 diabetic patients were switched between the biosimilar Semglee and the reference product Lantus versus just staying on the reference product Lantus. So this product is now approved as interchangeable with Lantus. Again, it's eligible for pharmacy level substitution, and we'll talk a little bit more about that concept. The other interchangeable product that is currently approved in the US is Siltezo. It's an adalimumab biosimilar. So again, the application contained data and information to support interchangeability that was coming from a switching study. So again, looking at the comparison of subjects who were switching back and forth between Siltezo and Humira versus those patients that are just staying on Humira, looking at PK similarity in patients with chronic plaque psoriasis. Also looking at comparison of efficacy, immunogenicity, and safety profiles for those patients who are switching versus those patients who were not. It is important to note they were able to conduct one switching study in one indication, and they were able to then extrapolate to receive approval as interchangeable for the balance of the reference product indications and that which the biosimilar was already approved for. So those are listed here as well. And extrapolation, again, is been discussed in other forums, is really a foundational concept within biosimilarity, and it also applies within interchangeability. So FDA has looked at product-specific aspects as it relates to interchangeability. And they've done this for biosimilarity as well. And FDA has done this as well as other regulatory authorities globally, really focusing on what's necessary in terms of data and information to support a demonstration of biosimilarity or interchangeability. So in the context of interchangeability, FDA has issued product-specific guidance for insulin, noting that in general, insulin biosimilars would not need to conduct a switching study to receive an interchangeability designation. And this is really because of what's known about insulin in terms of its ability to be characterized on a structural and functional level, understanding the mechanism of action, understanding the immunogenic potential of insulin. So FDA has issued guidance really around this concept of low residual uncertainty about immunogenicity for insulin products, even in the environment of switching, such that an applicant would generally not need to conduct a comparative clinical immunogenicity study, a switching study, to support interchangeability for an insulin product. So otherwise, in general, products are expected to undergo this prospective switching study to support a designation of interchangeability. But there's conversations with FDA that need to happen for every drug development program. This is the only place the FDA has issued product-specific guidance for interchangeability to date. There's also an opportunity in the US for exclusivity for the first interchangeable biosimilar product. So it is entitled when eligible for a period of exclusivity. So that exclusivity period is a period of time during which FDA must wait before granting a subsequent biosimilar to the same reference product at interchangeability designation. So there's multiple exclusivity triggers and considerations that we won't get into here. It's a bit complicated, but the bottom line is that the applicable trigger that would result in the shortest of any of the exclusivity periods is what would apply in a given situation. FDA is expected to issue guidance on exclusivity for first interchangeable biosimilar products in the future. It's on their guidance agenda. So we're hoping to see this fairly soon from the FDA. There's also proposed legislation that's under discussion that may impact first interchangeable exclusivity provisions. So we'll see what that legislation looks like if it comes to fruition and whether there's any impacts on the exclusivity provisions. So we've talked a little bit about this concept of pharmacy substitution, about the designation of interchangeability in the US that's made by FDA for an interchangeable biosimilar, then can make it eligible for pharmacy level substitution. So what it says in the US statute is that an interchangeable product may be substituted for the reference product by a pharmacist without the intervention of the prescriber. So you can see here a little schematic of what that would mean. The prescriber would write a prescription for the reference product. It would go to the pharmacy. The pharmacist would look at it and say, there's an interchangeable biosimilar product. I can then give the patient either the reference product or the interchangeable biosimilar. And there's a number of factors that would go into that. So one of the important resources that we have in terms of making this decision around substitution that can help guide both prescribers and pharmacists is what's called the Purple Book. And this is a database reference that is maintained by FDA that lists all of the approved biological products. So it's a searchable online database that, again, includes all of the FDA-approved biological products and does have information noting which products are the reference products, which products are biosimilar, which products are interchangeable with a given reference product. So this is here as a tool for healthcare providers as well as patients to look at what biological products are approved, where there is a biosimilar, and where there is an interchangeable biological product. So in terms of pharmacy substitution in the US, so again, FDA would make that designation that a biosimilar is interchangeable with a reference product. But in the US state pharmacy laws control substitution. So FDA will make that regulatory decision, but then it's up to the states and the laws that they pass in terms of driving pharmacy substitution for biological products. So right now, once an interchangeable designation is acquired for a product, so again, that designation is made by the FDA, a biosimilar may be substituted for the reference product by the pharmacist. That's in states that have approved legislation or have regulations that are establishing a state standard for biosimilar substitution. And as of June 2022, a total of 50 states, DC and Puerto Rico, have all enacted legislation establishing substitution laws for interchangeable biosimilars. So there's a good framework in the US around the potential to be substituting biological products where you have an interchangeable biosimilar. So with that, I thank you for your attention and look forward to questions.
Well, thank you so much, Leah. Now it is my pleasure to introduce Durham Juan Reiger. She is a long-standing patient advocate and currently serves as the president and CEO of the Canadian Organization for Rare Diseases. She's also active with a number of other organizations. She is a council member for the Rare Diseases International Organization. She is a director for the Asia Pacific Alliance of Rare Disease Organizations. And she also serves as president and CEO of the Institute for Optimizing Health Outcomes. So I will turn it over to you.
Thank you very much. And really, I can't express my appreciation and the opportunity to take part in this. I also run to apologize up front not being able to stay for the Q&A, but I'm actually in the middle of another conference and I need to go immediately this to join a different panel that I'm on. But in fact, this is such an important topic and it means so much to us as patients to be able to continue to have this dialogue that I really did want to participate. So I'm going to go through fairly quickly. I think a lot of the messaging you've heard certainly from the patient perspective from Gail already, and certainly I think a lot of what you've heard also echoes kind of what the physician said. So this is just the introduction. I think one of the things that I want to do, and I think Gail alluded to it already, is certainly patients and those who are not in favor of non-medical switching are absolutely not against biosimilar. And certainly, as we know in the rare diseases space, there aren't a lot of biosimilars. In fact, there may be almost none, but we look forward to the opportunity to actually having other entities available to patients. And I think this is a really important statement here that we're not anti-biosimilars, we're pro-biosimilars, long supported in terms of definitely the notion that we can reduce costs of biologics by having more competitors. And sometimes that's competitors that are, similars, also there are competitors that are similar therapeutics in that space. Nobody, I think, is more concerned about cost of medications than those that are in the rare diseases, where because of the cost of production and the small number of patients, these therapies tend to be individually expensive, though having, at the end of the day, somewhat lower budget impact. But we definitely want to make sure that we have more options for patients and absolutely more treatment choices. So patients really do, as we say here, benefit from having more options on the table. So we are definitely pro additional options. What we don't agree with is what you've been hearing over and over again. And I was so pleased to hear, the physician perspective as well. And that is that we do believe that at the end of the day, what we need to have happen is patients being able to make decisions about their treatment choices with their physicians. And what we don't want to have happen, I think, as you've heard again, is that others who are not the patient and the physician being the ones that are able to make those choices. I was actually at the table, many years ago when the first Northwich study was done. And I think at that time we were quite concerned, and I think I was the only patient there, with the level of the actual research that was being done to suggest that there was in fact no impact on patients in terms of switching. We're thrilled with seeing the level in which the research has taken place and the amount of data that's coming forth. But I think what we're still really concerned about is what we see here is that we do not necessarily track real world data. And I think we said at that time, and we say again, the lack of evidence that we do not have impact on patients in terms of non-medical switching does not mean that there isn't an impact. It means in many cases, we're not tracking that information. I mean, certainly in the for the patient's perspective, we know that individual differences do occur, and we need to be able to monitor that. We've been talking all along about real-world evidence, and we need to set up those systems so that we can track. And I think as Gail and others have indicated, when we do track, we do find that there are individual differences, and that's what we're concerned about. And we also want to say is that unnecessary switching, and this is a huge part, and I don't need to read all of this to you, but you've heard over and over again, especially with biologics, we definitely know in terms of the increasing route we're going towards personalized medicines that are not only matched to genetic and genomic individual variations, but also lifestyle, other kinds of factors, including environmental factors that influence how the patient responds to a medicine. That can take a long time, and these are difficult pathways that patients go through. So what we want to make sure is that we don't take patients off unnecessarily, and we don't want to put patients into a position where they do suffer an effect and then find that they're not only going to be physically resistant, but psychologically. and really traumatized by that. There is no need for us to do that to patients. Again, when there are options on the table, we need to make sure that those options are brought back to a patient-physician decision, and that the patients have a very strong voice in terms of making those kinds of decisions. At the end of the day, it's the patients that have to be extremely comfortable with taking the medicines in order to continue to take the medicines, and certainly, as we know, to benefit from them. I mean, this is one of the notions that we talked about, is that the oncology patients, when we look at the research that's been done, we know that this is a very sensitive area, that these biologics are highly specific, and they're becoming even more specific. And I think this is, again, a really big concern for patients. If they're stable on it, they don't want to have to be changed to something. And certainly they don't want to be changed to something just because produce savings for the system, but not necessarily be best for the patients. Again, this is something that really results in not only physical potential trauma, but certainly serious psychological trauma for patients. Now we're seeing, as we're saying, biosimilars come into ophthalmics, especially now we're talking about people that are very sensitive, could be seniors. Again, we want to make sure that there is, in fact, the opportunity for the patient and the physician to have that dialogue, to decide what is most appropriate, and to, again, not unnecessarily switch a patient if, in fact, there is the potential for a risk, or if there is not any need to make that switch. We're very, very concerned in terms of the potential trauma for patients in a very, very sensitive area as well. And again, where many of these patients could be seniors. So we've been raising these concerns for years, and I'll just give you very quickly the highlights that we've done. Since I said I've been involved in this space for a very, very long time, did a number of surveys across a huge number of patient organizations, patient groups, and patients individually. And what we find is that, yes, of course, patients are supportive of biosimilars. But at the end of the day, what the message here is very clear, is that they do not want to make sure that there is non-medical switching. And I think that's the concern. Patients have the right to make an informed choice. They have the right to make sure that they can stay on the medicines that's working for them, especially one that they may have taken a long time to get stabilized on. And certainly they do not want to feel that they're being pulled off simply because it could be cheaper for the system, expensive for the individual patient. What we really want to do is, I think you heard Michael say at the very beginning there, is looking at where the successful models have been. And I've been involved in the European space for many years as an international patient advocate. And we have supported many of the countries that have been able to introduce biosimilars and be able to introduce switching, but not as a mandatory non-medical switching. And I think that's where we've seen so much uptake. We've been pushing Canada for many years now from the patient perspective, and certainly in consortium with our physicians, to really look at these models, to find ways in which we can definitely manage the budget impact, but also to make sure that patients are actually going to be well served. I think we also have the downstream effect of concern about what happens if we try to keep pushing prices lower and lower to the point where we are not going to have the biologics on the market. We're not going to have the variety of biologics. And I know we're a long ways from the concerns that we might have had with some of the chemical drugs, where we all of a sudden find ourselves with one generic, two generics, and not adequate supply. This is something that would have been a disaster for us if we're thinking about, what the future might hold. So again, supporting competition, supporting absolutely lower prices, not done in a way that's going to provide a risk to the patients in terms of treatments that are best for the patients, or also having a healthy supply of alternatives on the market. So the reality is, as we say, and we've heard over and over here, we don't have to sacrifice patient-physician choice in order to achieve biosimilar savings. We do want to look at where there have been good examples across Europe and looking at how these have been introduced, engaging the physicians, doing the education, engaging the patients, and yes, being able to switch where, in fact, there is comfort from both the physician and the patient to do so, but not forcing automatic substitution. not forcing for non-medical reasons, and certainly not at the end of the day limiting through some kinds of mandatory compulsory limitations just on the basis of pricing in terms of the patients that the products that are available. We would like to see Canada at the very forefront in terms of introduction of the biosimilars, not picking up on what would be the worst of the practices. So in conclusion, we want to encourage biosimilars. We just disagree with how it's being done in Canada, wanting to go towards best practices and looking at where there have been successful introductions. And we do say very, very strongly, patients need to be a partner in this. Patients need to feel comfortable with it. They need to be able to work with their physicians. And we think that at the end of the day, of course, we will end up with the right balance and the right opportunities to introduce savings and to make sure that we also have a healthy supply of biologics. So thank you very, very much for the opportunity.
Well, thank you so much. I'm so glad that you were able to join us today. Our last speaker before our panel discussion is Professor Phil Snyder. I always learn something new every time I hear Dr. Snyder speak. Professor Snyder is a professor of pharmacy at The Ohio State University. He's also very active in a number of organizations. He serves as the International Advisory Board Chair of the Alliance for Safe Biologic Medicines. He is past Vice President of the International Pharmaceutical Federation and also past President of the American Society of Health System Pharmacists. Professor Snyder also serves as a consultant to industry and on multiple boards. Dr. Snyder?
Thank you, Stephen, and thanks for the opportunity to be with you today. My job is to provide a brief summary of the comments that have been made to now and lead into our panel discussion that will follow my presentation. I might add, in addition to the nice introduction from Stephen, that my major area of focus at the College of Pharmacy is on medication use management with a particular focus on medication safety. So as we head into the closing panel, let's seed the audience and the panel with a few questions that relate to the issues that have been raised in the excellent presentations that have been given so far. Some things that we may want to consider in evaluating the Canadians, the policies in Canada that are focusing on non-medical switching in the various provinces are these questions. Does non-medical switching and forced switching achieve savings? Does it put the patient at the center of policy making, which is fundamentally what health policy is intended to do? Does it adequately consider the concerns that have been shared from physicians and their objections to being forced to make decisions that aren't necessarily in the best interest of the patients for whom they care? Does it reflect the principles on which it was enacted? In other words, is the Canadian policy really catching up to Europe? Is it using that model as a way to emulate their success with biosimilars? Does it promote a sustainable biosimilars market long term? And finally, does it build confidence in biosimilars? So Michael, in his earlier presentation, pointed out this white paper that we published last year, looking at as a critical review of substitution policies for biosimilars in Canada, and it's available using this QR code if you would like to read the entire paper. And one of the issues that we raised is in the Canadian policies, little transparency is part of the development of policy in the provinces in Canada. And in contrast to the ones that have been most proscriptive, which include Norway and Denmark, and reference has been made to those countries involve patients and prescribers or physicians at the beginning of the process, so that the policy was developed as a way to balance the effectiveness and safety of biologics and biosimilars with the responsible use of limited resources. And I think we can all agree we don't want to waste money in healthcare. On the other hand, we don't want to save money at the expense of the quality of patient care. And so the savings that have resulted in the early experiences, particularly in British Columbia, have been substantial. As you can see, the top graph shows the uptake of biosimilars in Canada overall, but in a province where biosimilars forced switching policy was implemented, the uptake was substantial. So short term, they were able to achieve a pretty substantial uptake in biosimilars using forced switching policies. But this artificially achieves market share and loses any savings that might occur naturally by having competition in the marketplace, which most other countries think is a better way to encourage responsible use of limited resources long term. And so one might raise the question, are we simply replacing one monopoly, in other words, the reference product monopoly, with another monopoly? The question is, are the patients being given priority? I've heard statement from patient organizations, nothing about me without me, as far as medical decisions go. And patient objections have been voiced, as you can see in the statements that are shown on this slide on the right-hand side, to forced switching policy, and this has been done over a number of years. And in tweaking these policies, a number of exceptions can be created, but they don't address the fundamental problem with these policies because it makes the patient-physician relationship secondary or tertiary rather than central to the patient care process. Recall that the physician is the one who's responsible and accountable for the care of the patients, their own patients. And so disrupting that patient-physician relationship can be problematic. So we've heard about the physician concerns and the variety of surveys that have been done. And so again, given their central role and the training that they have, they are the most qualified person to make medical decisions overall, but certainly for the patients for whom they provide care. And so balancing these patient-specific factors against these policies is a fundamental role that a physician needs to have. And you can see when they're taken out of that picture, they raise serious concerns and objections. So as we've seen, the Canadian policy was developed in spite of a lack of some statements from Canadian agencies that recommend against it. And here's the one that was mentioned earlier from INES in Quebec. Non-medical switching in patients as being treated with a reference product is generally not accepted by learned societies and consulted clinicians. So in spite of that, we see policies being developed in the various provinces requiring non-medical switching or forced switching of patients on biologic therapies. So as you can see in the quote on the right side here, the policymakers often cite experiences in Europe as the benchmark and an evidence-based regulatory practice, and cite that as the model for their policies in Canada. But as we've seen, those policies are not similar to the European policy. In Europe, governments have achieved success by avoiding automatic substitution, by preserving and expanding rather than restricting patient-physician choices, and achieving their savings through price competition in the market by having many reimbursed products. And so that's the direct opposite of what we see happening in Canada. So to repeat the slide that Michael showed, and from our white paper that was published in GaBI last year, when we looked at the European experiences and looked at best practices across the various European countries, we found some principles that explain the success that they've had. And those include physicians having the freedom to choose between off-patent originator products and available biosimilars, having tenders for multiple products that look at criteria other than strictly price, and having a level playing field among all participants and manufacturers is the best way to foster competition in the market, which will result in price reductions as opposed to mandatory discounts that artificially place downward pressure on manufacturers. And one could be concerned about the sustainability of a market where price points are so low that people choose not to enter into the marketplace at all. And so as a result, we have fewer biosimilars and perhaps even fewer reference products. We've seen from the data that has been suggested that physicians do have confidence in biosimilars around the world, and Canada is no exception. But what they want, because their practice is based on evidence-based practices in science and research studies in the clinical setting, is studies that show the safety of switching. And they want to be involved in the substitution decision because they're the ones that are responsible for the patient. And these are attitudes that are consistent among physicians around the world, not just in Canada, but all around the world. And so ignoring and dismissing these concerns certainly builds tension within the medical community towards health policy, and certainly doesn't engender confidence in the use of biosimilars. So as we see in the US, we're beginning to catch up. And so we are addressing these concerns by the points that have been raised, particularly in Leah Crystal's presentation, of having a definition for an interchangeable biosimilar that requires data, and having substitution policies that make it clear not only when a substitution can occur, but what was not mentioned is that these state substitution laws specify that the pharmacist and the physician must be in communication. In other words, the pharmacist does not have to get approval to make the substitution, but they have to communicate with the prescriber and the patient when a substitution is made, so that transparency exists. So why is non-forced medical switching failing? It's because it's ignoring the concerns of the patient who are receiving these medications and have concern about their own welfare, of course. The relationship between the patient and the physician is very critical to making treatment decisions. And if they remove that from the equation, there needs to be a very high burden of proof about the consequences of policies, given the fact that you're taking responsibility away from the patient and physician and imposing upon them by a regulatory fiat. It's clear that the Canadian non-medical switching and forced substitution policy are failing to meet the standard because they ignore physician concerns and objections. They fail to let confidence grow through data. They are making priority over short-term savings by requiring switching over long-term savings that might result from a healthy competitive market and might undermine the growth and sustainability of the marketplace. And in fact, they fail by seeking a shortcut to uptaking savings rather than creating the conditions for which these desired behaviors, in other words, support from the prescribers and from the patients, will occur naturally over time, which is a system that has worked in Europe and now in the US as well. So with that, let me lead into our panel discussion and turn the forum back over to Stephen, who will moderate our panel. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Snyder. I'd like to, looking at some of the questions that are coming in from our audience, and I'd like to start off by maybe giving some of our patient advocates to lead off with a question or two. So everybody obviously can jump in, but perhaps Jamie and Hiroshi, you can take the lead on this one. Could you tell us a little more about the costs that are associated for the patient and also for the healthcare system? But I'm thinking in particular about the patients when there is any type of medical switching, but in particular when there's non-medical switching, whether that's in Canada or anywhere else. Can you talk a little bit about what burdens there are?
Yeah, I can begin. And maybe Urvashi. I can begin. So again, my name is Jamie, and I'm from the Gastrointestinal Society. So I'll be more speaking towards the perspectives of patients in IBD, from the IBD community. So Crohn's disease primarily, and ulcerative colitis, and some of the burdens to patients associated with non-medical switching in Canada that occurred. Well, as Gail mentioned, in the context of Canada, we have patient support programs. Fortunately, they are funded by pharmaceutical companies, so the government does not have to have the burden of cost with those the healthcare teams associated with those patient support programs and the coordination of care between their gastroenterologists and the healthcare teams at these programs. But there are also testing involved and additional appointments. As Gail spoken to in her presentation, there were some delays in communication that have resulted in this, and also, what's really common in IBD, especially the biologics in IBD, is dose escalation. So there needs to be additional appointments and more testing for adjustments of dosages for patients in IBD, just because of how often patients have inadequate or loss of response with some of the biologics, and there's also really a limited number of biologics available in IBD. But we know in comparison to rheumatology, dose escalation is rare. So that's just also another thing to consider. And actually, the Canadian Association of Gastroenterologists in Alberta conducted a study where they found that with about 2,000 patients in IBD, they found that gastroenterologists will need to schedule a minimum of 650 clinic hours just to process the administrative of a non-medical switch for all patients. And so that's just some of the points from my end, and Urvashi can take the lead from hers. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I just want to start off by thanking GaBI and ASBM for inviting the International Federation on Aging to this webinar. So we're very thankful for this opportunity. To address the question, essentially the two main things that come to mind. One of them is the risk to loss of stability of the patients on their treatment, especially since, as mentioned, it takes several years for a patient to find the drug that works well according to their immune system. So the loss of stability is a high risk in this case. And also, as Ms. Gail Atara mentioned, there are some geographical and logistical challenges that come with accessing biosimilars, especially when the clinics for Biologic are separate compared to where the biosimilars are. So there are those challenges as well.
One of the points I might add is that usually switching therapies is done for cost-based reasons, and so that may improve affordability for the patient, but it also may undermine confidence because of perception that they're getting a less expensive and potentially inferior drug, and that creates this phenomenon which is widely discussed called the Nocebo Effect. And so for patients to have confidence in a biosimilar, the clinicians, be it the prescriber or the pharmacist, often have to spend time with the patient describing the nature of the switch as a way that may be done for cost reasons and improve access and cost, but also in a way that won't have an impact on the effectiveness and safety of therapy. And so those conversations can be time consuming.
So just as an aside or physician perspective, I was lead author on a white paper from the Digestive Disease National Coalition, where we looked at non-medical switching and also authorization, step therapy, et cetera. Every type of pharmacy manipulation and control on prescriptions has a cost to the system, increased cost, lack of adherence, et cetera. There are hidden costs to the system. And the white paper goes through that. And actually, most of the references are actually from the pharmaceutical industry reference journals. But there's a lot of studies out there showing that there are hidden costs, as the patient advocates were saying, that it's not a simple switch at the pharmacy and you walk home with a different bottle or something. There's a lot of hidden costs to the system. So that can be looked at, and just the idea that you're going to save some dollars switching from the left hand to the right hand is not what this is about. These are complex people with complex chronic diseases that have to be looked at individually. And so it's simple to give this one-dimensional perspective to a patient, but that isn't what's there. So I'm just echoing and supporting the prior comments.
Super. We're getting some questions coming in about just what is a practical way, for example, for a patient organization to try to keep track of developments like the interchangeable status, and I think this is envisioning a world in which there's a growing number of increasing drugs. And I wondered if Leah or others could comment a little bit on how best for folks that aren't former FDA officials, for example, how to track that in a practical way.
Yeah, so I think that, one of the best ways is really FDA's Purple Book. I think that they, really keep the database up to date. It's got all of the approved biological products, and there is information in there that notes which products are biosimilar to a given reference product, what products are interchangeable with a given reference product. They've set up the database so that if you search for a brand name or the active ingredient, that all of the available products will come up. So prescribers as well as patients will be able to see what products are approved. Not every approved product is available. They haven't necessarily all launched, but it will at least give a good overview about what products FDA has approved. And again, give their status regarding whether they're a reference product, a biosimilar, or an interchangeable biosimilar. FDA usually does share information when they're approving new products. So you can sign up for their news feed, the distributions that they have about when they're making new approvals as well. But really the Purple Book is one of the best resources that we have right now in the US.
If I may just add on to that, this really reiterates the importance of having information publicly available and the data to be updated regularly, so that it helps patient organizations facilitate the patient education that they're trying to do, to ensure that the correct information reaches the patient in a timely manner for the decisions about their treatments to be made.
So I did see in the questions that, it talked about as well, products that, are in trials, biologics, ultimately that may become, interchangeable. So things that are in development. There's really not a good, all-encompassing resource for that. So, it really comes down to information that might be in the trade press, information that manufacturers share publicly about the products that they're developing. There, is always, forward-looking speculation that's coming out from market analysts, other folks about, what reference products may be coming off of their exclusivity period that then would be ripe for biosimilar product development. But there's really not a good resource for that. Most companies will, keep some of that information confidential to begin with. So it's not always publicly shared. So unfortunately, there's really not a good sort of baseline database resource for that. It's really just, keeping on top of the trade press, looking at market analyst positions, and, the patient organizations, can potentially keep track of that information themselves and provide that as a resource. But it would require that somebody's sort of doing that data mining.
I'd also like to add in the terms of Canada, because Health Canada, our federal regulator, has deferred the authority to our provinces and territories for interchangeability status, that can result in variability of what the policies will look like. And so, as already mentioned, patient organizations have a role in getting that data mining forward. Unfortunately, it hasn't happened yet in Canada where with interchangeable status, but unfortunately it will be, we predict it might be variable just because of the jurisdictions.
Well, thank you. When Urvalshi made reference to transparency, it reminded me of one of the questions we got about, and maybe Professor Snyder, if you could lead us off in this. Could you talk a little bit about comparing Canada? We've talked a lot about Canada today, but comparing that with some of the experiences in Norway and Denmark and the EU, and touch upon the transparency issues there. Can you unmute your? Yeah.
Yes. Trying to keep the side noise to a minimum. So thanks for the reminder about unmuting. When I've been to Europe, I've asked regulators from Norway and Denmark specifically, because they've been the most aggressive in terms of single tendering systems and so forth. And the two things that have come out with the conversation is, number one, they involve patients and physicians in the policy at the front end, rather than just making it a regulatory decision that excludes prescribers or minimizes them anyway, and physicians. The other is that they have provided opportunities for alternate therapies to be selected by the physician in the interest of their patients. And so Norway in particular has moved away from a single tender system to a multi-tender system because of supply chain issues, to assure the availability of the kinds of treatments that the physicians in Norway want. And I guess the third thing is culturally, in those countries, physicians and the government and policymakers have agreed on the need to address the issue of the rising cost of healthcare, the accessibility of healthcare services to all of the citizens of these countries, but to do so in a way that recognizes the individual patient needs and so forth. So I think recognizing that the effectiveness and safety of therapy is paramount, but another important decision that has to be discussed is the responsible use of limited resources, and an unfettered pricing policies may jeopardize that. So it's not an issue that should be off the table, but it shouldn't be trumped by issues such as the effectiveness and safety of therapy. So those are countries that have had that kind of transparency, and that's the kind of transparency that appears to be lacking in Canada.
Steve, if I could jump in there, what I have found interesting is the Norway regulator, the Danish regulator, the European Commission, the Norway and the Danish regulators will say that what we're doing in Norway, what we're doing in Denmark, does not necessarily work in other countries, including Canada. They will say that. I was in a meeting with the BC government in the beginning when they were talking about it, and the regulator gave a presentation on on their policies around the North Switch study and all of that, but then basically said that probably wouldn't work in Canada. And the Canadian government that was there just kind of didn't focus in on that part of the presentation. I play a game throughout Europe as I've gone to a lot of different DIA and other meetings and European Commission meetings and so on. And it's, where are the Canadians? I'm always wondering why the Canadians are not in Europe. If they're always talking about modeling after Europe, you really don't find them there. And so I think these European Commission meetings, which they've had every no more than 5 years, they've had 5 of them already, have been incredible opportunities to go and basically listen to how the Europeans have done it. They're very self-reflective. They talk about what's worked, what hasn't worked. They're very forward-looking to say, just the most recent meeting, that October 2019 meeting, they basically said, look, we've learned that single tenders don't work. So if you're going to do a tender system, have multiple winner tenders. They said very specifically, and I mentioned this in my presentation, they talked all about, they had the presenter from Denmark presented. And then at the end of that, they said, but don't look to Denmark as a model, because there are a lot of differences in Denmark, and some of them were mentioned. Including the fact that, as they said specifically, that they have a electronic medical record for every patient in Denmark. So there's things, the Canadian system, which when one of the concerns early on was, well, how are you going to track adverse events? And they said, well, we're going to do it by basically, looking for increased hospitalizations, tracking increased hospitalizations. It's not a realistic measure. And so, I think a lot of the work that we have done in Canada, ASBM, and working with Gail's organization and Durham and others, has been basically to say, if you're going to keep talking about the Europeans and now the US, because we are doing extremely well here, as well as has been pointed out in today's presentations and in the last webinar where we talked about the US and the EU kind of models. If you were doing a tutorial and you were inviting the government in the beginning to say, what are you looking for? Specifically in Dr. Snyder's presentation, he laid those things out, those factors that are critical to a long-term sustainable program. The Canadians are simply not taking that approach. And so, province by province, they've moved through it. The question is, at what point have you gone too far with that particular approach? Or, the stakeholder consultations that have happened in Canada have not been like the European Commission consultations. They've been relatively black box and really with no feedback. It's not interactive at all. And so I think that, a lot of the reason, as I said in my presentation, for these two webinars being paired together was one of these things doesn't belong here. You can look to the US and the EU and look at all the things they've done correctly, and then you can look to Canada and know that at some point it's going to be problematic for them, or they're just going to kind of move forward and say, basically, as the Danes, as they say in Denmark, we don't give the patient an opportunity to weigh in. We just make the decision. We tell them we're switching. And it's certainly not a long-term way to buy and build confidence. Steve, you're on mute.
Thanks, Michael. I can see that we're not going to be able to get to all the questions, but I was hoping to sneak another one or two in if we could. This in part comes from some of the regulators that we have that are in different countries around the world. And could you all comment on what you think is the most important thing that policymakers should consider when they're contemplating a long-term sustainable biosimilar program? And I wanted to let Michael and Leah comment a little bit on that from their backgrounds as policymakers, and also get Dr. McKibben's take on that.
Leah, you can go first.
Yeah, so I'll comment on, sort of the regulatory policy space, given that that's my background. I'm not going to get into, payment issues and reimbursement, other things. It's not my area. I think others might comment on that. But I really think from a regulatory standpoint, global regulatory authorities, especially, competent regulatory authorities like FDA and EMA, PMDA, others are really looking at, scientific alignment, looking at leveraging global development programs, recognizing that, biosimilars are really being developed globally. We want to ensure from a development standpoint, manufacturers aren't conducting studies that they don't need to conduct. There's aspects about using data from studies that uses what's kind of referred to as a non-regionally approved comparator, that you can have bridging to support the relevance of that data to make sure you're not duplicating, clinical studies that need to be conducted. So really looking at opportunities to streamline development, make sure that it's efficient, making sure that the products are moving through development in a timely fashion, going through the approval process, meeting those stringent regulatory standards, which we know build confidence in biosimilars. Stakeholders are confident in biosimilars globally because these stringent regulatory authorities have robust regulatory standards. They have confidence in what regulators are doing in terms of approving those products. And when the regulator says this is approved as a biosimilar, you can expect, that it's going to, be as safe and effective as the reference product when your patient is using it. That means something. And so it's important to maintain those stringent regulatory standards to maintain that confidence and ensure that the gains that we've seen in terms of the uptake and acceptance of biosimilars globally is maintained. You don't want to pull that down and tear that away. You want to make sure that that continues. So I think regulators are very focused on that, but again, are looking really at efficiencies around global development, to bring biosimilars to the market in a timely fashion.
And I just build on that, Leah. I think you actually bring up two really good points. The first one is streamlining of regulatory standards is really important in terms of delivering a high standard in an efficient way. But the conversations that are going on around the globe, as you know well, are about reducing regulatory standards, about making them less stringent, and particularly looking at countries that have a harder time meeting those standards. And that is a position that we, ASBM, and I've been in Europe, having these conversations, even with European regulators, about the morality of looking to those places that can't afford to keep standards that are equivalent to what the EMA or the FDA or even Health Canada meet, and say we need to look, even the discussions that are going on with the WHO about reducing certain standards in order to make it easier for some of these developing countries. And the position that we have taken is that, and it's a great place to start, the confidence we have today is because of where those standards are. And you should not lower those standards no matter where you are. And I think that's a really important foundational point in terms of the confidence. The surveys that we've done and shared across Latin America, the US, Canada, EU, have all shown really high physician confidence in biosimilars. And that's because of where the standards are. With regards to the other piece, though, the larger policy piece, without getting into CMS and reimbursement policies and all that, I still do think, because at heart, I'm ultimately someone who's been really interested in the policy development of it. It's almost like a parent looking at somebody who's doing a child is doing something the wrong way, and you're saying, why do you keep doing it that way? We're trying to provide you with a roadmap to say, okay, you talk in Canada, again, consistently about the Canadian approach, and all that you hear is about catching up to Europe. But you cannot catch up to Europe or the US or elsewhere unless you really understand foundationally how they have gone about what they have done to reach that success. And you see where the US is today in terms of the level of competition and the impact that has on the driving down of price and access for patients. And ultimately, I think there's just a frustration that eventually, before it gets to Ontario, they'll figure out that the approach that they're taking is the wrong one. It certainly is not good for patients. It certainly is not good for physicians. It certainly does not increase confidence in any way, just because, and when you hear those kind of argue for the Canadian approach, and you've heard from Canada, interestingly, they've come down to the US and talked about how the US should follow in Canada's footsteps. And yet our program is much more robust and much more patient and physician focused, and clearly set up for long-term sustainable biosimilars where competition continues to increase and be beneficial for patients. So to me, that's, Leah hit it in terms of the most important feature, and that is those regulatory standards, but it's also in really looking at, foundationally how you increase competition, how you encourage others to get into the marketplace, and how you continue to basically build out that confidence with the physician and patient community.
I think as a physician, I certainly agree with everything that's been said. From the advocacy, patient-physician-patient relationship, transparency is the key. If you look at, for instance, drug studies and approvals, the definitions of endpoints change with time. What used to be considered a success is now much more stringent. The transparency and data that we will continue to collect and monitor the safety, the immunogenicity, et cetera, effectiveness of biosimilars is the key to improving the future. I don't think this is an endpoint. The interchangeability, I think, is, in my opinion, the next step to give the whole system the confidence on what we're doing. And I would anticipate in the future, when we find a flaw, you can't tell me it's going to be perfect. We're going to look at it. We're going to find something. We'll change the system and how we do it. That is, the 360 concept of continuous improvement is what gives us the confidence in our system to move forward. And I think that will allow us to streamline. Interchangeability will cut costs. People will be able to substitute at the pharmacy, less hassle, cost at the office, the repeat office visits, et cetera. So I think this is the way to do it. And I see that going on in the meetings that Michael was talking about in Europe, you know, with everybody at the table talking about the best practices. That's the key. And that's how we're going to do this, I think.
We had another question come in about shortages, and the questioner noted that we're starting to see some shortages in Europe. And so I think the question is, how best can we, as policymakers and other stakeholders, how best can we try to forestall shortages of biologic products, whether they're the original products or the biosimilars?
Well, as a pharmacist, supply chain issues are first and foremost on my mind, because we have to manage them all the time. And drug shortages and supply shortages have been a problem for a long time, but even been worse with the COVID situation and the global supply chain issues. What we've seen in the U.S. recently is infant formula shortages, and that happened because there was a very concentrated source of infant formulas. 70% of them came from one manufacturer. They had problems with their manufacturing facility, and as a result of it's a business that was price point dominated, and so there weren't that many alternate providers available, and so the U.S. had to import formulas from other countries in order to meet the demand in our country. So I think certainly squeezing the marketplace so that there are fewer competitors in the marketplace and fewer sources of products, so that the capacity to produce products is limited, is one way to be vulnerable to supply chain shortages and not having medicines available when they're needed.
And I would add to that, Steve. In 2004, when I was at the department, we had a vaccine shortage. And that vaccine shortage was 96 million doses of flu vaccine, 1/2 of the U.S. supply. And it was directly a result of, number one, it was a regulatory issue in the EU, where an EU regulator just basically said, you know, we originally were told it would be 10% of the 50, and then meaning 9.6 million doses were to be affected. And then by the time it rolled around to October, it was half of the supply because we had 2 manufacturers. And so it really goes to the vulnerability of, you know, limited number of manufacturers. It shows how important competition is. And that's specifically, you know, an example with flu vaccines and how important that is. And it's one of the reasons that the EU has talked about, even with regards to tenders, having multi-winners, because you could have shortages. If you have a single winner tender system, then you could have a shortage with that particular winner in terms of being able to guarantee supply. Not just because there may be a supply shortage of things, you know, but because of like the vaccine shortage, which was a regulatory issue where basically it was a problem, and the regulator said the doses, 100% of your doses are not fit to be used. So it is certainly a concern, and it really shows how important it is to have multiple competitors.
Well, it looks like we're up against the hour. I wanted to thank all of you for participating in what I learned a lot listening to all of you today, and I really appreciate everybody putting the time in to prepare for this. And I'd like to thank our audience for actively participating. And I don't know, Michael, did you, as one of the sponsoring organizations, did you have any last words before we sign off?
I just want to, again, as I did in the last webinar, I want to thank Lazia Tong at GaBI, who was off screen, but really done an incredible amount of work working with us in Brussels, 6 hours ahead, many, many long nights to put this together. I want to obviously thank all the panelists for their participation, to Gail for putting together that presentation. We look forward to the next webinar and to continued work in these areas, but definitely want to thank everybody for their participation, and as Steve said, for those who are attending.
Super. Well, thank you very much, everybody. We're going to sign out now.
Thanks a lot.